Hi there, welcome to part 2 of my presentation of the strongest points made in the first 11 parts of Private Eye magazine's excellent special report on the injustice done to Miss Letby. On this occasion, I'm going to start with a basic bread and butter clinical reality MD Dr. Phil Hammond highlighted, that being just how challenging and literally in statistical terms hit and miss it is trying to establish cause of death in premature neonates. I quote, "A study of 1,000 infant deaths in southeast London found the cause of mortality was unexplained for about half the newborns who had died unexpectedly, even after post-mortem examinations." A post-mortem is a post-mortem though, something usually conclusive in alternate legal reality. MD reminds us that 6 of the 7 babies whose deaths have been laid at Miss Letby's cell door had post-mortems carried out at the Regional Centre of Excellence, Alderhay Children's Hospital. I quote, "In 5, the pathologist certified 1 or more natural causes of death, and in 1, the cause was certified as unascertained, but was not categorized as unnatural." End quote. I understand that the only reason the 7th did not have a post-mortem was because a consultant mysteriously specifically requested one did not take place. The point is, 6 of those 7 convictions involved overturning a post-mortem. How often does that happen? It's certainly the first time I've heard of such an event. To emphasize this point, MD uses a couple of facts about one of those 7 babies, child C, the one Miss Letby evidently harmed from home using telekinetic powers like something out of the X-Men. Those facts highlight the precariousness of his viability and the stunning free pass Goss gave Dewi Evans in court. You're all probably familiar with the vomited black bile and absence of bowel movement from neonatologist Richard Taylor at Mark McDonald's press conference back in December. What I wasn't aware of was a serious complication to the pregnancy called placental insufficiency. I quote, "He was born at 30 weeks, weighing less than 2 pounds, 800 grams to be precise, because of placental insufficiency. One nurse described him as the smallest baby I have ever seen." End quote. Child C also had pneumonia and respiratory distress syndrome, always the case with babies coming into the world that small and therefore undeveloped. Unsurprisingly, in light of the breathing distress, an X-ray taken the day before his death showed air in his stomach. Several neonatologists are on record in the special report stating this is a standard side effect of the second-tier response to an oxygen desaturation event, where a bag and mask is used as it covers both mouth and nose. The post-mortem after the baby's death concluded the death was natural, exacerbated by the lack of blood flow in the womb. MD gives information that the coroner supported this finding. That wasn't good enough for Sherlock Evans though. I quote, "However, the prosecution later argued his death was caused by Letby deliberately pumping air into his stomach to put pressure on the lungs." End quote. MD then further expands, I quote, "Evans decided Letby had attempted to murder the baby by injecting air down the nasogastric tube. This caused consternation in neonatal circles. One consultant told me, 'It's bollocks. Babies get too much air in the stomach all the time with all the bagging and masking and CPAP, and all you do is take it out again.'" During the trial, this fanciful supposition was even rendered dead on arrival by evidence that Miss Letby had not ever been on duty between the baby's birth and the X-ray showing air in the stomach. not one to allow even so apparently insurmountable a hard fact to prevent the giving of expression to prejudice, Evans went for the ultimate Hail Mary by, mid-trial, dropping the evidentially debunked method of attack on the charge sheet, replacing it with a new, entirely different murder method. As on the facts, it would not now be possible to convict Miss Letby of introducing air into the baby's stomach prior to the all-important X-ray Evans originally relied on to claim murder. He simply switched his own method of attack from the X-ray evidence air in the stomach to something equally impossible to prove or disprove after 8 years. Something which, crucially, Miss Letby, or anybody else for that matter, could conceivably have done in the time between her first physical proximity to the baby and its actual death, that being injection of air into a vein. This had the advantage of being something already familiar to the jurors. That convenience for all concerned, except Miss Letby of course, must be the reason Goss, unbelievably, allowed him to thus literally change his story during the trial with no impact to his credibility or damage to the prosecution case. MD's own acerbic take on this particular instance of justice being locked in the cellar is worth repeating. I quote, "The judge reminded the jury they didn't need to understand the means of death. Just be sure Letby had intent to murder when she volunteered for extra shifts, rather than intent to buy a new house." End quote. Comically, official records apparently still show Child C as murder using Evans's original method, because Tattle Life lists it as follows: 14 June 2015, obviously. Count 3, Child C, a baby boy, murder, bolus of air in NG tube, nasogastric tube, guilty 10-1 majority. To shift the focus back to the general of the woeful, if not broken, state of the NHS at the time of the Countess of Chester neonatal unit spike in deaths, MD gives the following information. I quote, "In 2015, when the excess deaths started at Chester, the infant mortality rate in England and Wales rose for the first time in a century. A survey found 2/3 of the country's neonatal units did not have enough medical and nursing staff." End quote. The spike which has seen Miss Letby labelled a serial killer was therefore part of a national trend. In fact, the question has to be asked: is Miss Letby's prosecution and conviction what collective insanity looks like in a secular post-industrial society? I'm forced to make this point because MD gives information that babies and mothers are apparently dying unnecessarily all over the country. He states that there are currently, I quote, "multiple maternity inquiries, Morecambe Bay, Shrewsbury and Telford, East Kent, Nottingham, etc., aimed at figuring out how to stop NHS staff accidentally killing numbers of babies and mothers." He adduces further support from the statistical side. I quote, "Statisticians argue that the increase in death and deterioration of the sort seen in Chester happened by random fluctuation in neonatal units across the UK, that there was never anything abnormal about what happened on Letby's unit, and that the police should never have been called in." End quote. Further, and crucially, again I quote, "Statisticians also argue that because these variations are so common, you could call the police into many neonatal units and, using the same methodology, find a nurse who was present at many of the deaths and charge him or her with murder. This is one reason the Letby case is putting nurses off a career in neonatal care. Even John Gibbs, who has been busy crucifying Miss Letby since retiring in 2019, was telling a different story in 2016. I quote, "In July 2016, Dr. John Gibbs, a senior consultant paediatrician at the Countess of Chester, wrote to his fellow clinicians, 'The increase in neonatal mortality that we have experienced over the last 18 months might be within expected statistical variance.'" End quote. Gibbs's U-turn is a neat opportunity to shift back to the particular from the general. MD makes the point about a dichotomy within the staff of the neonatal unit, which can only be extremely insightful to a person of any intelligence seeking to get a handle on the likelihood or not of Miss Letby being a murderer and the case in general. The group convinced she was a baby killer and united by that belief was that of the 7 consultants, who only had a member actually see Miss Letby at work twice each week. The remaining staff, the nurses and junior doctors who worked with Miss Letby on a day-to-day basis, however, believed her innocent of any wrongdoing and were so outspoken in that support that, curiously, the RCPCH, Royal College of Paediatricians and Child Health, found it necessary to remove some of those words of support from their final report, which was nevertheless wholly supportive of Miss Letby. That brings us to one of the more unsavoury pieces of information in MD's special reports. As mentioned in part 1, MD has corresponded at length with both Dewi Evans and one of the consultants. I suspect Jairam, because for me he's clearly the most brass-necked of the 2 ringleaders. But not a single nurse or junior doctor contemporary to the events has felt able to respond to his efforts to communicate with them. As an explanation, he cites Daily Telegraph reporting of intimidation. I quote, "The Daily Telegraph has reported that nurses and resident doctors who tried to speak up on behalf of Letby were told they should not give evidence, as to do so might harm their career." Citing the same report, he adds, I quote, "None of Letby's fellow shift workers gave evidence against her. Some wanted to speak up for her, but were discouraged and threatened, according to the Telegraph." End quote. Inevitably, over the years, such systematic coercion will bear fruit with the weaker characters. Last month, we were subjected to the depressing and unedifying spectacle of 2 of Miss Letby's former shift colleagues selling their souls to the Thirlwall Inquiry's hidden agenda. Regarding the sham that is Thirlwall, MD includes the pre-inquiry Rule 9 questionnaire of one courageous former shift colleague of Miss Letby's. This person makes it clear, in no uncertain terms, that her position on Miss Letby has not changed since staff were first interviewed on the subject by the Royal College in September of 2016. MD reports that this lady, and others like her, were subsequently informed by the inquiry that they were not being called to give oral evidence. To quote MD's own take on that bit of information, "The stench of cover-up grows stronger." That's what he said. Moving on to another interesting revelation. As previously mentioned, MD has corresponded with one of the Gang of 4. In the course of their communications, MD and the consultant agreed that a prominent senior neonatologist, known to both, could be relied upon to provide a fair and balanced opinion on the whole case and, the murders and so alleged murders. Here is that solicited opinion. I have only seen the prosecution's summarizing opening statement. I have only seen the prosecution's summarizing opening statement. I've not been privy to the details of the evidence, but what I've read troubles me deeply. The cases all have much more plausible alternative explanations than those alleged. Yet the defense appears not to have made many of these obvious points. Many of the prosecution's comments are medically illiterate, and so too many of the expert witness comments. Why weren't these challenged? Why didn't the defense have better medical advice, or, as Professor Mike Hall is experienced and credible, why didn't they use the advice they were given by him to better effect? On the basis of what I've seen, this conviction is wholly unsafe. It totally shakes my faith in the competence of the law. End quote. Strong words, right? She also gives a revealing take on the next thing I'll come to, which we'll obviously come to. MD reports that on 27th April 2023, Benjamin Myers tried his own version of the American football 50-yard pass into the end zone by filing a no case to answer submission to Goss. I quote, Myers had argued that there was no case to answer because of the paucity of evidence and because some of the modes of murder were so unusual that no one could reliably be called an expert on them, and certainly not the two retired pediatricians for the prosecution. End quote. In all honesty, I'm not sure what to make of it. Without doubt, it is valid, and in a case perhaps where the state had not already expended millions, would probably have been successful. Also, if he'd had great confidence in that stratagem, that tactic, whatever you want to call it, this might explain not bothering with the bread and butter stuff like experts, obviously 6 on the prosecution side, 0 on his side, on the defense side. But even on that interpretation, it seems a recklessly high-risk approach to take, given the stakes. After 6 months, he also had to have had an idea that this judge was not one the defense was ever going to get any change out of. MD sent the full transcript of the submission to his neonatologist for an opinion. I think the same one I quoted previously. Here's what she said. Right. The defense tries to argue that the evidence of air embolism is inadmissible, but their argument is incomplete. What the defense should have done was first explain why a conclusive diagnosis of air embolism ante-mortem, before death, is extremely difficult. Ergo, no one, not even extremely experienced neonatologists, people like her, would be able to claim sufficient expertise. Second, why, once a diagnosis of air embolism is made, which, as the literature leads us to expect, is usually post-mortem, the next consideration is the question of the cause. The literature is clear that vigorous cardiopulmonary resuscitation, high-pressure ventilation, when you have those desaturation events, poor intravascular line management, and deliberate injection of air are all possibilities. Then, third, point out that these babies all had vigorous cardiopulmonary resuscitation and high-pressure ventilation, and there was evidence of a relatively inexperienced staff, understaffing, and a somewhat chaotic unit that had innumerable instances of shortcomings in cover, equipment, and infrastructure pointed out over a considerable period of time, i.e., plausible backdrop to poor line management, all of which indicates that deliberate injection is the least likely explanation. And the final, and to my mind, crucially important point in what should have been a logical sequenced argument is that plausible alternative explanations existed for the deaths stroke collapses of these babies. Apparently Benjamin Myers is, or at least was, one of the most formidable and respected barristers in the country. How does that square with this evidence that the submission of no case to answer, which in the absence of defense team experts, challenge of the statistical basis of the death rota, and so many other omissions and apparent oversights, was the one knockout punch opportunity of a technically overmatched boxer, a mile behind on points and dealing with a biased referee. Yet the punch was thrown in what expert analysis identifies as a lazy, half-hearted manner. Something else I learned from MD's special report was that shortly after the Royal College of Pediatricians and Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health September 2016 visit, a further, more granular review was initiated by management. Management who, at this point I have to say, cannot really be criticised for their handling of this business at any point, except perhaps for not referring the vendetta and general recalcitrance of Breary and Gyram to the General Medical Council for disciplinary consideration in April of 2017, before the real harm was done with the commencement of that police investigation. Anyway, what they did was they invited Jane Hawdon, a senior neonatologist from the Royal Free Hospital in London, to undertake what is described as an advisory medical report involving the review of 17 of those neonatal deaths. This was in October 2016, the month after the Royal College's report. This more granular inquiry echoed the RCPCH one finding, I quote, "A number of deaths that could have been prevented with different care and identified major or significant suboptimal clinical care in 14 of the 17 cases." End quote. The report said further forensic investigation was needed to identify the cause of 4 deaths. This was subsequently done by experienced Alder Hey pathologist Dr. Jo McPartland. She found nothing to suggest or support foul play. As MD states, Jane Hawdon's report had to be pivotal to any defence of Miss Letby, demonstrating as it did the likelihood of suboptimal care as a cause for the collapses and failed resuscitations of at least some of the babies, and from a neonatologist more senior than any deployed by the prosecution. Putting to one side the question of why the defence did not call Jane Hawdon, MD asks the question of how it can be the case that Jane Hawdon and her report do not get a single mention across the entire transcript over the 10 months of that trial. The explanation MD has been given is that Miss Letby was not charged with all 17 of the deaths that Jane Hawdon reviewed, only an apparently insignificant 9 of them. Therefore, Jane Hawdon's report was deemed irrelevant to the overall case and therefore excluded from evidence. All that can be said in response to this particular instance of justice being pushed down into the cold, dark cellar is that they were simply making up the rules and changing them as they went along. Another instance of this is MD's information that the prosecution was allowed to have their cake and eat it in relation to the absence of definitive Guildford lab insulin testing. MD confirms that in child L's case, as was the case with child H, which I was familiar with myself, the crude, limited immunoassay at the Royal Liverpool University Hospital was relied upon, and with no sample as procedurally required for a criminal matter being sent to Guildford. Despite this, the prosecution was allowed to roll out the director of the Guildford lab, Dr. Gwen Stark, to look the jurors in the eye and corroborate the accuracy of the immunoassay insulin results. I wonder how Dr. Stark feels now. As many of you will be aware, Roche, R-O-C-H-E, however you pronounce it, the manufacturer of the immunoassay used at the Royal Liverpool University Hospital, has felt it necessary to come out and set the record straight on misrepresentations about their test told to the court to facilitate Miss Letby's conviction for attempted murder on those two insulin cases. You just know that there are like barefooted people in the third world laughing at the UK over this case. In finishing up, much as I hate to give so shameless a self-publicist attention, I have to speak about Evans again. One thing MD revealed which I was unaware of was that Evans received one substantial fee for his work in dreaming up the methods of attack, which Miss Letby was subsequently charged for, and a second substantial fee from the court for the job of reviewing the credibility of his own concoctions during the trial. That really cannot be right. Finally, in December of 2022, we have Goss's senior judicial colleague, Lord Justice Jackson. Goss is only a Mr. Justice, writing to warn Goss of Evans's unreliability from personal experience in a previous case, where he had found his evidence, quote, worthless, and Goss simply disregarded the warning. To avoid finishing on these two objectionable individuals, what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize MD's position across all the 11 articles of the special report I've read. It is essentially that the conviction is totally unsafe because the jurors only got half the story, not hearing from the following 6 sources. 1. Colleagues supportive of Miss Letby, obviously, who were deterred from giving evidence. 2. Experts convinced of more plausible explanations than murder for babies they knew to be sicker than the court, or more sickly, or less viable, however you want to think of it, than the court was led to believe, was told. 3. Miss Letby's counsellor regarding the post-it notes, who I believe was the head of occupational health. 4. A representative from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health regarding that September 2016 report, which fully supports Miss Letby, despite the fact that a lot of the supportive words of her colleagues, junior doctors and nurses, were redacted from the final report. 5. The pathologists who didn't diagnose foul play in any of the post-mortems undertaken, 6 of the 7. And 6, finally, they didn't hear from Dr. Jane Hawdon, who reviewed 17 cases and found serious failings of a care type in the area of, in relation to suboptimal care, I should say, but no evidence of foul play. Okay, that's part 2 finished. Please feel free to share your thoughts and any information you think might be of interest in the comments section below. As usual, thank you for your time, thank you for watching, and all the best.